Comrades and friends, welcome to the program Global Weekly News, serial number 185. First, the US war on Venezuela began in 2001. The current US attacks against Venezuela are part of a two-decade process led by the United States and the Venezuelan right wing to undermine the Bolivarian project and its bold decision to use the country's oil wealth for the betterment of its people. In 2001, Chavez's Bolivarian process passed a law called the Organic Hydrocarbons Law, which asserted state ownership over all oil and gas resources, held activities of exploration and extraction for the state-controlled companies, but allowed private firms, including foreign ones, to participate in activities such as refining and sale. Venezuela, which has the world's largest petroleum reserves, had already nationalized its oil through laws in 1943 and then repeated in 1975. However, in the 1990s, as part of the neoliberal reforms pushed by the IMF and by the large US-owned oil companies, the oil industry was substantially privatized. When Chavez enacted the new law, it brought the state back into control of the oil industry, whose foreign sales were responsible for 80% of the country's external revenues. This deeply angered the US-owned oil companies, particularly ExxonMobil and Chevron, which put pressure on the government of US President George W. Bush to act against Chavez. The US tried to engineer a coup to unseat Chavez in 2002, which lasted for a few days, and then pushed the corrupt Venezuelan oil company management to initiate a strike to damage the Venezuelan economy. It was eventually the workers who defended the company and took it back from the management. Chavez withstood both the coup attempt and the strike because he had the vast support of the population. Maria Corina Machado, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2025, started a group called Join Up, which placed a recall referendum on the ballot. About 70% of the registered voters came to the polls in 2004, and a large majority, 59%, voted to retain Chavez as the president. But neither Machado nor her US backers, including the oil companies, rested easy. From 2001 till today, they have tried to overthrow the Bolivarian process. The question of Venezuela, not so much about democracy, but about the international class struggle between the right of the Venezuelan people to freely control their oil and gas and that of the US-owned oil companies to dominate Venezuelan natural resources. Two events took place in 2013-14 that deeply threatened the Bolivarian process. First, the untimely death of Hugo Chavez, the driving force of revolutionary energy, and second, the slow and then steady collapse of oil revenues. Oil prices peaked in June 2014 at roughly $108 per barrel and by January 2016 fell below $30. Before 2013, the United States, its European allies, and oligarchic forces in Latin America had already forged their weapons for a hybrid war against Venezuela. After Chavez won his first election in December 1998, and before he took office in 1989, Venezuela saw accelerated capital flight as the Venezuelan oligarchy took their wealth to Miami, weakening monetary stability. By 2006, Venezuela faced restrictions for access to international credit markets. After the death of Chavez, the United States began a focused hybrid war against Venezuela. Hybrid war refers to the coordinated use of economic coercion, financial strangulation, information warfare, legal manipulation, diplomatic isolation, and selective violence. US illegally placed financial sanctions on Venezuela in August 2017. The living standards in Venezuela collapsed between 2014 and 2017. Mercenary attacks, sabotage of the electrical grid, creation of a conflict generated to benefit ExxonMobil, invention of an alternative president, provision of Nobel Peace Prize to Machado, attempted assassination of the president, bombings of fishing boats off the Venezuelan coast, seizure of capturing of oil tankers, leaving Venezuela built up of an armada of the coast. Each of these elements is designed to create neurological tension within Venezuela, leading to the surrender of the Bolivarian process in favor of return to 1998. If the country was to return to 1998, as Maria Corina Machado promises, all the democratic gains made by the communes as well as by the Constitution of 1999 will be invalidated. In October 2025, Maduro told an audience in Caracas, "Listen to me, no war, yes peace, the people of the US." That night, in a radio address, he warned no to regime change, which reminds us so much of the endless failed wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya and so on. No to CIA orchestrated coups. Second item, comrades. Mexico President criticizes US. "This is a matter of the sovereignty of the people of Venezuela," said Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president. She expressed her concern over the US aggression on Venezuela as a matter of the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people. For a country to use force to take away a president, we can never agree with that. Third item, comrades. The current situation in Venezuela by Vijay Prasad and Carlos Ron. Vijay Prasad is the executive director of the International Center for Social Research, and Carlos Ron is one of the officials of the Institute of Social Research. Let us look at what they say about the current situation in Venezuela, both by Vijay Prasad and Carlos Ron. On the early morning of January 3, the US government launched a massive attack on Caracas, Venezuela, and 3 states of Venezuela. Roughly 150 aircraft swarmed the skies, bombing with exceptional ferocity. Residents of the city had never experienced such violence. Loud explosions, massive plumes of smoke, and aircraft plunged the city into darkness. US used advanced electronic warfare systems. Allied Delta Force troops descended from the helicopters to the location where President Nicolas Maduro was spending the night. They faced resistance from soldiers on the ground, but overwhelming firepower from the air killed 24 Venezuelans and 32 Cuban soldiers. Once ground resistance was neutralized, the Delta Force captured President Maduro and Venezuela National Assembly member Cilia Flores, Maduro's wife. They were taken to the USS Iwo Jima, a modern US warship. and then flown to New York. 6 people, including Maduro and his wife, Diosdado Cabello, Minister of Interior, and 3 others were indicted, alleging that they corrupted once legitimate institutions to import cocaine into the US. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez assumed leadership in Maduro's absence. She held a widely publicized meeting with all main political leaders. In this initial meeting, Rodriguez called for the release of Maduro and Flores, emphasized that Nicolas Maduro remains the legitimate president, and confirmed that the government remained intact. Within a day, Rodriguez, now sworn in as acting president in the absence of Maduro, said that she is open to discussion with the US to prevent another attack, though she continued to insist on the release and return of Maduro and Flores. Rodriguez's father was the founder of the Socialist League, in which Delcy Rodriguez and Maduro once served as cadres. There is no question of any surrender of the Bolivarian process. The weapons and technology used for attacks on Venezuela in 2026 are far more superior than the US used in 2003 aggression against Iraq. Yet, it did not take long for the people to take to the streets. A spontaneous open mic outside the presidential palace drew crowds to speak out against the attack. Their clarity was striking, yet corporate media ignored this coverage. On 2nd January, President Nicolas Maduro met the high envoy of Chinese President Xi Jinping. They discussed China's third policy paper on Latin America. They reviewed the 600 ongoing projects that are being jointly conducted between China and Venezuela, and $7,000 crore Chinese investment in Venezuela. Chinese Foreign Ministry said such hegemonic acts of the US seriously violate international law and Venezuelan sovereignty and threaten peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean region. China firmly opposes it. China does not have the capacity to roll back US hyper-imperialism through military force. Within Latin America, the rising tide of the right-wing forces, led by Argentina's Javier Milei and Ecuador's right-wing president Daniel Noboa, celebrated the capture of Maduro. Argentina led a group of 10 countries to block a condemnation of the US violation of the UN Charter at a meeting of 33-member Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. These countries are Argentina, Bolivia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Trinidad and Tobago. CELAC, once able to stand for sovereignty, is now dragged into support for US intervention adventurism in Latin America and for Trump's orientation towards the revival of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine. As per this Monroe Doctrine, only US could control the whole Americas, including Latin America. CELAC was established in 2010 to form a regional body excluding the US. Its first co-chairs were right-wing Chilean President and Venezuela's left President Hugo Chavez. This kind of unity between both right and left forces is now weakened beyond recognition. Trump has openly pledged to revive the 1823 Monroe Doctrine as Trump Doctrine, Trump thesis, like that. This doctrine signals the US aim to restore old oligarchies across the hemisphere and grant US conglomerates free rein. This is class struggle on a continental level. Fourth item, comrades. 80 people die when US attacked Venezuela. Several days after the US attack on Venezuela, the official number of dead is still unknown. According to a senior official quoted by the New York Times, the death toll stands at nearly 80. Nearly 100 wounded were being treated after the attack as per Venezuelan doctors. The Cuban government declared 2 days of national mourning for the death of 32 Cuban soldiers killed during the US attacks on Venezuela. National mourning was observed for 2 days in Cuba. Fifth item, comrades. US aggression destabilizes international order, says China. Countries participating in the UN Security Council emergency meeting on Venezuela on 5th January called the US aggression illegal and demanded the release of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. In the New York court proceedings on 5th January, Maduro declared that he is a president of a sovereign country and pleaded not guilty on the charges raised against him. Maduro also asserted that he is a prisoner of war and must be treated accordingly. Mao Ning, the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry, said, "No country should put domestic rules above the international law. China calls on the US to release President Maduro and his wife at once and ensure their personal safety. China insisted that all countries should respect the development paths chosen by the people of other countries and abide by international law and the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter." During an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council held on 5th January, several countries, including Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, South Africa, Brazil and Mexico, condemned the US aggression on Venezuela, calling it a blatant violation of the UN Charter. Venezuela's ambassador to the United Nations asserted that despite American actions, Venezuela remains politically stable and its government enjoys full control over the territories of the nation. Even France, a close ally of the US and a NATO member, claimed that the US attack on Venezuela and kidnapping of President Maduro contravenes the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes and non-use of force and undermines the very foundations of the international order. Sixth item, Venezuelan women reject US attacks in mass march. Thousands of women, Venezuela women, took to the streets to denounce the illegal US strikes on their country and demanded the immediate release and return of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, the first combatant, Cilia Flores. They also expressed support for the recently sworn-in acting President Delcy Rodriguez. Last item, comrades. Africa voices outrage against US invasion of Venezuela. African states, social movements, trade unions and political parties, socialist and communist parties, have responded with strong condemnation of the invasion while expressing solidarity and support for the people of Venezuela. South Africa, in a formal statement, put the question, where is the international rules-based order? Where is the international rules-based order? Are we back to the law of the jungle now? Ghana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a press statement. Trump's statements that US will run Venezuela until such a time as we can do a safe, proper and judicious transition, and that large US oil companies will be asked to go in, are reminiscent of the colonial and imperialist era. The National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA, issued a statement which concluded as follows. The world is today faced with the stark choice, capitalist barbarism or socialism. Zambia Socialist Party called US action as a war crime. Tunisia's Workers' Party denounced the act as state terrorism. The Communist Party of Swaziland declared that the struggle against imperialism is inseparable from the struggle for global liberation. Thank you, comrades. Lal Salam. See you next week.